Continuing on with chapter 16 on page 437. These are the ways that oil spills can be cleaned up. Booms corral the oil to be sucked up by skimmer boats. And so you have these big old booms. I'll show you them right here. All right, so on this page, these kind of stringy things are called booms. They're basically like floating tubes that you can drag your ship along, and it will corral the oil into kind of this circular area, and then you can suck it up because it's concentrated by a skimmer boat. We can add genetically modified bacteria to digest the oil. We can disperse it with chemical dispersants, but the problem with chemical dispersants is we don't know the long-term impact to the plankton of these chemicals that have dispersed the oil. Another type of pollution is excess nutrients. So fertilizer runoff, sewage runoff can create dead zones through eutrophication, but they can also do something else. They can cause harmful algal blooms, and we sometimes call these red tides because it's not blood, it's a type of plankton called dinoflagellates that are red, actually. So if you don't normally see their color because there's not very many of them in the ocean, but when they have a ton of nutrients from fertilizer, they bloom and they just go crazy and make lots and lots of copies of themselves. And then they're so concentrated that you can see their color. Now they produce a toxin, and so when there is a red tide, they tell people don't eat shellfish like clams or mussels because mussels are filter feeders and they will filter out, they eat the plankton out of the ocean, which contains the toxic. So people have gotten sick and died from eating shellfish and other fish, plankton eaters during a red tide because they produce so much toxin. Another type of toxin is domoic acid. It's not from a red tide, but it's from another plankton bloom. It affects the seals and sea lions off the coast of California, and that's from the plankton bloom. Page 438, now we're going to talk about overfishing. In the next 20 years, 90% of the fish will be eliminated from the ocean due to overfishing. And in the United States, that just kind of stinks because fish will become expensive, but for us, we can still get our protein from land animals. We have a lot of land. But Asian countries like Japan and China and Philippines, they rely on the ocean for their protein. And so if you don't have fish, they're not going to have enough protein, and this becomes a food security issue. All right, so why in the last couple of decades have fish all of a sudden been horrifically overfished? Well, it has to do with new fishing technology. So you can see some pictures here of drift nets, long lining, and bottom trawling. So the fishing technology that came about in the last couple of decades is sonars, satellite imaging, thermal sensing. First, it leads to huge catches and then to population crashes. All of these methods give you bycatch. Basically, you're catching things you're not supposed to, and you throw them back and they usually die. So this is a fishing boat, shrimping. So they're trying to scrape for shrimp here on the bottom, but 90% of bottom trawling doesn't get shrimp, it gets other species, and then they throw them back. It's a huge waste of marine creatures, and it scrapes the bottom, it ruins the benthic habitat. It's a big problem. Know the pictures and captions here for all the forms of fishing. So when there's a population crash, the Fish and Wildlife Service in the U.S. goes in and starts to regulate it and give quotas. So this is an example of tragedy of the commons. So you can see here what happens with bottom trawling. So this is a benthic community. Here's a halibut or some kind of fish like a halibut. And after bottom trawling, it's totally scraped and destroyed. And so that's a big issue with bottom trawling. And over here we have some pictures here of the cod decline. So cod was going along just great for hundreds of years, and then We have these new techniques, sonar and satellites, and then all of a sudden the catches skyrocket. Well, then they crash, and now you can't get Atlantic cod. They still haven't recovered in like 10 or 15 years. They still haven't recovered enough to where they can open up the fisheries yet. So know the graph on cod decline. All right, on page 442, what can you do as a citizen? You can make sustainable seafood choices. So these are sustainable choices. These are not sustainable choices. So if you like salmon, get wild caught or Alaskan salmon because they are heavily regulated and they make sure they don't catch more than what is sustainable. They have quotas and limits to prevent tragedy of the commons. Now, some farmed fish is very sustainable. They take care of their pollutants, and some is not. So you'll see here some farmed salmon is not sustainable because of disease issues and pollution issues. Okay, on page 443, maximum sustainable yield. We've studied this before when we've studied like timber and lumber, but it's basically how many fish can be caught to still leave enough to reproduce for the next year's catch. And so in the U.S., the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for this. They figure out what's the quota, what's the limit for this year to make sure that there's still enough fish to reproduce for next year's catch. Know the definition of a marine protected area and a marine reserve. So what we've done is we have set aside some places like off our coast, the Channel Islands, that you can't fish in. But what it does is it gives baby fish a chance to grow up and get bigger. And it works. Now, fishermen hated them at first. They hated marine reserves. But they found out really within a few years that it's actually beneficial to them. And here's how. Reserves benefit fishermen and they benefit ecosystems too. So the densities of the organisms almost doubled. The biomass, it almost quadrupled. And the size increased by 31%. The diversity increased by 23%. And so fishermen now support the reserves because it helps the fish get bigger without being caught. All right, that's it for chapter 16.